Hello and welcome to this special live event to coincide with our current major exhibition, Tudors to Windsors, at the National Maritime Museum, part of Royal Museums Greenwich. My name's Chris Martin and I'm exhibition curator at Royal Museums Greenwich. And I'm delighted that we're joined this evening by my co-curator, Dr. Charlotte Bolland, who is Senior Curator for 16th Century Collections at London's National Portrait Gallery. Just to say that Tudors to Windsors is a unique collaboration between the National Maritime Museum, Royal Museums Greenwich, and the National Portrait Gallery. It features over 150 royal portraits from oil paintings, prints, sculpture, miniatures, photographs, coins and medals, which are really used to explore the development of royal portraiture over the last 500 years. Beginning with Henry VII and ending with our current Queen, the exhibition takes us on a journey of 5 dynasties or periods, showing how portraits of the King, Queen, their heirs and favourites have been used as statements of wealth and power, continuity and tradition, and how they were impacted by the personalities of the sitters, technological change, fashion and wider historical change. This evening, we're going to take a look inside the exhibition at some of Charlotte and my favourite portraits. Then afterwards, we will answer some of your questions and talk more about royal portraiture in general. So do send in your questions for the Q&A session in the comments, and we will answer as many as we can afterwards. So without further ado, let's take a peek inside the exhibition.
So here we are in the Tudor section of Tudor to Windsors exhibition, and I would say we're arguably standing in front of what is the most iconic portrait of a British monarch. What do you think?
Yes, absolutely. So I think many of you will recognise Henry VIII here in an image after the German painter Hans Holbein the Younger. And what we really have with Henry is this kind of frontal, confrontational image with this pose that I think in the sort of generations that followed, if you wanted to assume a kingly air, you just put your hand on your hip and stand with your legs apart, stare straight ahead, and Henry VIII comes to mind, and that image of power.
I think what's interesting as well is he's not wearing a crown, and there's no obvious regalia in this portrait, but you know it's him, you know he's the king.
He's wearing the most extraordinary clothes. He's got sort of cloth of gold, which was restricted to the king, studded with rubies, and then wearing a collar with diamonds and rubies. That in Tudor paintings, you'll often see that the black jewels are actually diamonds because they backed them with black foil, because they favoured the kind of lustre rather than the brilliance that we'll see in many of the paintings to come, because diamonds are definitely a common theme within this exhibition. But it was created for a very kind of private public space, the sort of privy chamber, the heart of Whitehall Palace, and very much an elite space where you encountered the king, and it was a sort of proxy for meeting the king in person. And over the course of the next only sort of 50 years, it's slightly, the iconography of it escaped from the palace, and it was reproduced and reproduced and reproduced, so that by the beginning of the 17th century, you could have a woodcut of the silhouette of this image of Henry, and it was called "When You See Me, You Know Me." So even then, the kind of popular imagination image of Henry VIII has widely disseminated, and I think that's perhaps why this is the sort of archetypal British royal portrait.
But it's a portrait that says absolute power, isn't it? It's a portrait that's sort of immense wealth, absolute power, and it's designed to intimidate. It's designed to sort of make you feel that you're in the presence of the king.
And at this moment, that sort of the question of the institution of the king and the person of the king are fully combined, that Henry had taken on more power than any king had had previously in being head of the church in England. So he is the most powerful man and monarch in the country. And again, that's something that sort of plays out within the exhibition, that idea of, are they being stressed as a person or as the monarch? The image of the king that's very much embodied in his clothing, in his stance, in his presence, but not really the sort of props of monarchy, the staging. And that's something we're going to see in the next portrait we go to look at of Charles II.
So we've now moved into the Stuart section of the exhibition, and we're standing in front of what I think is probably my favourite portrait in the whole exhibition. It's this colossal painting of Charles II attributed to Thomas Hawker. Hawker's interesting because he was an English artist and probably an assistant of Sir Peter Lely. And Lely really defined how we think about the royal court under Charles II and the later Stuart court. but Hawker was very much his assistant, and we think this painting is probably by him. I find this fascinating because Charles II is absolutely surrounded by the trappings of monarchy, but he also looks very sort of world-weary. He's sort of a bit fed up. He's coming towards the end of his reign. He was almost 60 years old when this painting was made. And I think there's this really interesting tension between him in his kingly role, but also in a role of a man who was slightly jaded, a bit fed up, lots happening at this time, really sort of almost ready to give up the throne to somebody else.
I think it's really interesting because you've got the sort of the humanity really comes across here. You really think of you're engaging with him as a person. So he's wearing the incredibly lavish robes of the Order of the Garter, which you can see in a number of portraits in the exhibition, holding a scepter, sitting in this extraordinary throne with angels crowning above him. So all the kind of props of monarchy are very much there. But this very much seems like you're encountering the man rather than the monarch. And he seems astonishingly to be able to be slouching on his throne. And this kind of the idea of the sort of the dissolute restoration court and this kind of louche sort of pose. So I think it does a brilliant job of really bringing Charles II to the fore as a character as much as the image of the king.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting as well because he's not afraid to be shown in that way. He's not afraid to be shown aging. He's not afraid to be shown that he's sort of had enough, if you like. I think what's also interesting, if you know portraits of Charles II, earlier portraits in his reign, that we still have this sort of focus on his legs being apart and the loin area of him. And I think there was still a sort of nervousness in terms of the fact that he hadn't produced a legitimate heir to take over from him. There's sort of to emphasise, if you like, his fertility, his virility, his ability to produce an heir, even at this late stage in his life. His virility wasn't in question, of course. He had at least 12 illegitimate children, but never produced a legitimate child with his consort, Catherine of Braganza. But I just think it's really interesting that even at this late stage, a lot of attention is put around the loin area of the painting.
Yeah, I think that's a kind of attention that you see in lots of the portraits throughout the exhibition, because that question of an heir is the sort of priority almost for many things. And so they operate on this, the portraits, on a different time frame, that they've got this amazing sense of kind of visual continuity, but they're also about showing the continuity of the dynasty, of the royal lineage. And so I think this portrait here with Charles towards the end of his reign makes a really interesting contrast with the painting we're going to look at next of George III at the beginning of his reign, and to kind of compare the characterization of the king. So here we have an image of a king at a very different stage in his life. So where the portrait of Charles II, the older man towards the end of his reign, somewhat perhaps disillusioned by the whole process, that here we have George III at the beginning of his reign. A much younger man, he came to the throne aged only 22, and so it is imbued with much more kind of optimism and looking to the future. I
think what's interesting here is that you've got a sort of the softer form of power, if you like. You've got a portrait that says monarchy, certainly with all the sort of accoutrements of being a king, but also it's saying it's all about grace and dignity within that role. So it's sort of less of a harsh projection of power than a sort of a more, if you like, slightly more approachable monarch, I think.
That idea of, I think in the Italian Renaissance they call it kind of sprezzatura, of that sort of elegance of the way in which you kind of comport yourself. Because if you think of the practicality of these incredible clothes, of the cloth of gold coronation robes and the enormous ermine robe, the weight of them, and yet he wears it so elegantly. This is as much as he is presenting himself as wearing the institution of monarchy, the responsibilities of monarchy lightly, because this is the way he can comport himself in the robes.
And also a portrait by a British artist. So in earlier sections of the exhibition, we very much see a lot of continental artists that are being brought to Britain to create the image of what the king or queen should look like, because they were seen to be more proficient in the art of portraiture. Here, by this point, we've got a real confidence in artists from England, Scotland. This is by Alan Ramsey, who's a Scottish artist. And we also see portraits by people like Thomas Lawrence and Thomas Gainsborough as well, being employed by the royal family to provide these great portraits of what they look like.
And this would have been a great commission to get, because for Ramsay and his studio, it was multiplied and multiplied so many times. I think they made
175 plus versions of this.
a great job to get.
And there are records of people going to his studio, seeing versions of this painting in various states of finish. So he was obviously churning them out, doing several versions at exactly the same time. But that's because there was such a demand for this image. The empire was expanding, so colonial governors wanted a copy of this in their offices. There was also a demand from the royal family, from the royal court, and also the aristocracy as well. This was the definitive image of George III.
And so this is really perhaps the first global image of the British monarch, because of the extent of British colonial power during George III's reign, that this was an image that was then disseminated to show Britain's authority across the world. So in many ways, this portrait encapsulates many of the themes of the exhibition about British royal portraiture. And it continues in the sections on the Victorians and then on the Windsors, the ruling dynasty today. And so we really hope you'll enjoy, because there's so much more to see.
I hope you enjoyed that look at some of the key works in the exhibition. You sent us lots of questions across Facebook and YouTube, so I thought we'd get on and answer some of them for you. Some brilliant questions coming through. First of all, I thought we'd answer one that's come through that says, is this a current exhibition? Just to say that the exhibition is currently running at the National Maritime Museum, part of Royal Museums Greenwich, and we're now entering the final month of the exhibition, and we close on the 31st of October. So do come down to Greenwich and take a look at some of the wonderful works that are on display. Some of the other questions that are coming through, someone asked, what is your personal favourite portrait from the exhibition? I might ask you, Charlotte, that first.
Yeah, well, there are so many great works in the show, but I have to kind of hold my hand up as a 16th century specialist that the Ditchley portrait of Elizabeth I is very much my favourite work. I think it can be properly classed as one of the icons of the National Portrait Gallery's collection. And it's just really extraordinary in terms of showing what's happened to portraiture over the course of the 16th century, that you can go from really small little works on panel to this extravaganza on canvas, kind of over life size, with the levels of allegory and text and image all coming together. So I think, yes, you can see it there on your screen, that you've got Elizabeth in front of stormy skies, turning towards the sunlight in this amazing clothing, and then includes a sonnet. So it just really encapsulates quite what you can do with royal portraiture if you go all in.
And of course, symbolism is really important, isn't it, in Elizabeth I paintings? I mean, they're absolutely loaded with it, aren't they? And I mean, looking at the Ditchley portrait, for instance, we've got so many incredible things that are included to convey a particular or construct a particular image of the monarch. So you've got things like the pearls, for instance, that are hanging around her neck are symbols of chastity. And also she's shown looking towards the light and away from the storm. So it's as though she's the bringer of light and the bringer of better times. And that's something that you see across all portraits of Elizabeth I, isn't it, Charlotte?
Yes, exactly. That there's a real kind of narrative of all the kind of different performances you can have as a queen. So she has the many different identities, and something you can really chart kind of across her reign. And that's one of the really interesting interactives that you've brought into the exhibition at Greenwich, is a sort of in-focus analysis of Elizabeth's portraits through the kind of lens of thinking about iconography.
I think performance is a great word, isn't it? Because they are so theatrical, these portraits, and they really are. I'm just going to talk about my favourite. I think I talked about it in the pre-record, that my favourite portrait in the show is the one of Charles II. I just think it's amazing because you've got Charles II, the monarch and the man, sitting together in that portrait. I mean, he is slouched. I think you used the word louche, which I think is a great word to describe him. But this is a man who is a bit fed up and towards the end of his reign and just is not afraid to be shown like that. And to me, that's just so alien in terms of royal portraiture. I mean, if you compare it to something like another favourite in the show is the George Hayter of Queen Victoria, the coronation portrait. I mean, for me, that epitomises what a royal portrait should be. You've got her sitting enthroned, holding her sceptre, wearing a crown. and it's very much an optimistic painting. It's a painting looking to the future, looking away from the sort of scandals and of the past, and looking away from the sort of illness and the debauchery of the past towards what is to come. It's a lovely optimistic portrait, and it's something that you see again in Elizabeth II's coronation portrait as well, which is almost staged in a very similar way.
I really like, in looking at the Hater of Queen Victoria, the staging of the lighting, again, that kind of divine light almost shining upon the monarch.
It's spiritual. It has a spirituality to it, doesn't it? Which is quite incredible. Someone's also asked, what's the earliest portrait in the exhibition? Charlotte, shall I?
Yes, that's
your area of expertise.
My specialist subject. So the earliest portrait in the exhibition is the portrait of Henry VII, which is actually the earliest painting in the National Portrait Gallery's collection. It dates from 1505, and we know this from the wonderful inscription on the bottom. And this really comes from a moment when portraiture, royal portraiture, was incredibly practical, that you shared it between the dynasties of Europe in order to know what a potential spouse would look like. So it's going to be something that's portable. This painting has a really unusual feature in that it's actually got an integral frame. So the frame and the painting are one piece of wood. So again, great for the kind of transport of it. And this is for Henry VII to communicate to the Habsburg dynasties. So this is placing the Tudors as their among their peers of the courtly dynasties of Europe.
And it's very much manipulating the image in terms of because he was getting on a bit, should I say, when this painting was done. But he's very much looking like a middle-aged, virile man, isn't he? I mean, he looks a bit shifty to me in that portrait. It's a great portrait, and also it's sort of devotional in terms of he's wearing a piece of jewellery that shows his allegiance to his potential wife.
Exactly, that he's wearing the collar of the Order of the Golden Fleece, so with a little fleece hanging from it there, whereas the vast majority of kind of chivalric orders you'll see in the exhibition is, of course, the Order of the Garter, the English chivalric order. And so a number of the sitters are wearing the kind of extraordinary robes with sort of blue velvet and lots of very fine, thinking the Duke of Buckingham, fine calves on display in the robes of the Order of the Garter.
And also Charles II, of course.
Yes.
In that rather extraordinary portrait. Somebody's asked, are the portraits in the exhibition in reigning order? Yes, we very much took the decision, didn't we, to make sure that they were in reigning order. I think it's quite nice to see that continuity and that development through time, and we did also ensure that we featured every monarch in the show, as well as we've got consorts, we've got favourites, we've got heirs as well, so there's a real mix of them in all different media, so portrait, oil paintings, sculpture, coins and medals, miniatures, all sorts of media.
And that's the thing that I really enjoyed working on this exhibition, because so often you learn through the process of exhibition making, because many of these portraits are often on permanent display in the National Portrait Gallery, but amongst their sort of subjects, as it were, within the chronological hang. And pulling out the monarchs as a sort of strand shows the strength of the collection in this area, but really allows you to tell the story of portraiture in a really particular way, because these are all individuals who've shared this very particular position in society, all members of their family or closest associates. And so it allows you to really see the kind of changing fashions, changing trends, and the changing relationship of the monarch to their subjects through the kinds of image that they want to project. So whilst I've been very familiar with these images beforehand, I've come to see them afresh through this exhibition.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And it's probably worth saying as well that we've managed to also take advantage of the fact that the National Portrait Gallery is currently undergoing some refurbishment, add and embellish the exhibition with some rather iconic pieces from the MPG collection. But we've also actually included works from the Royal Museums Greenwich collection as well, which is nice to see side by side with some of the works from the MPG. Next question, someone's asked, will the actual garments that are featured in the portraits be on display? Just to say that none of the garments themselves are on display in the exhibition, but there are garments on display in the exhibition which relate to various royals, including a rather splendid piece of armour that was made for Henry VIII's son, Edward VI, which was made at Greenwich, actually, at the Royal Armouries, when he was about 12 years old. We also have the most adorable sailor suit that's from the National Maritime Museum's collection, which was made for Albert Edward, Prince of Wales, when he was a child of about 5 years old, made as a gift for Prince Albert by Queen Victoria. And we also have Edward VIII's Admiral of the Fleet uniform, which and it's nice just because you're able to bring the sort of physical presence of the monarch into the space, which is a really lovely touch.
But one thing that's really kind of the most enjoyable thing. One of the most enjoyable things to look at in the portraits is the extravagance of the clothing and the level of the detail and the way in which they're recorded. So this is a show about kind of jewels, diamonds, gold, and that sort of, again, the changing fashions, because of course the monarchs are very much often the leaders of fashion. And so that's something that you can trace across 500 years of history in the exhibition.
Somebody's asked, how do portraits of female monarchs differ from those of their male counterparts? Now, this is interesting, isn't it, in terms of thinking about almost like the vulnerability of women in the position of monarch, especially for the earlier portraits. Do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, well, so very much that kind of a 16th century kind of question to address, in the sense of Lady Jane Grey and Mary I, both of whom feature in the exhibition, at a moment where artists and sort of society had to work out a language for portraiture, and so how you present a queen who is a queen regnant. And this is something that's kind of very interesting in also between Mary and Elizabeth, because Mary chose to get married to Philip II of Spain, and so she sort of adopted part of the iconography of the Queen Consort. That the image that we have in the exhibition, this small painting, is perhaps of the type that could have been sent to Spain or sent to Philip's court in order to share Mary's image. And she's sort of holding a flower, very much an image associated with marriage. That Elizabeth, in choosing not to marry, suddenly the idea of what a queen could look like, other than a wife, is completely open. And so then that is where I think that her sort of courtiers and artists went into overdrive into the many other identities that a queen could have. And that's another thing in the exhibition of that's the institution of monarchy, very much about primogeniture, and that how many times it's actually the story of not a straight line of male succession throughout British history. How many sort of second sons have inherited, but also how many queens England has had. And it's something you can sort of really experience as you go through the pacing of the exhibition, particularly in the sort of figures of, Elizabeth, Queen Anne, Queen Victoria, Elizabeth II, really kind of striking portraits. And it just makes you think about the monarchy in a slightly different way, of this very kind of masculine institution, but actually a very strong female presence.
Definitely. And I think the history of British monarchy is a history of what ifs, isn't it? There's so much of those, what if this person had survived? What if this person hadn't have died young? This is quite a nice question from someone. Do pets appear in any of the works in the exhibition? I love a dog in a portrait, and we've got a few instances in the exhibition. Pets themselves do appear in some of the later portraits from the Windsors section, and we've got a lovely photograph of the current queen of the young girl clutching her, I think it was a dorgie, a mix between a dachshund and a corgi, who was given to her by her father as a birthday gift, I think. We've also got a wonderful photograph by Dorothy Wilding of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, so Wallace Simpson and the previous Edward VIII, sitting either side of a table with a pug rather strangely sat in the middle of them. And there's a lovely story that goes with that apparently the Duchess used to liberally sprinkle her dogs with her favourite Chanel perfumes, so they smell around the house. So that's quite fun. And then there's also some animals that appear in portraits in the earlier section. So for instance, in the Stuarts, they're used for symbolic purposes. So we've got a portrait of Mary of Modena, which she's sitting alongside an Italian greyhound, so a nod to her Italian roots. And there's also a wonderful portrait from the studio of Anthony van Dyck of Charles I's 4 eldest children, where Charles II, who looks like a sort of mini king, is standing with his hand on this massive mastiff dog, which I think is a lovely portrait, and it is a real sort of sense of this child is ready to rule. He will be a great king. So they've been used for symbolic reasons, but also have been featured because they're pets of the monarch. Do some of the crowns still exist, or other jewels that are featured in the portraits?
Okay, Chris, this is your special subject.
Well, yes, certainly. There are also crowns that feature in the exhibition that no longer exist because of obviously the interregnum and the execution of Charles I led to the earlier crown jewels being broken down, sold off, melted down, including a rather wonderful crown that we know belonged to Henry VIII, which is featured in a full-length portrait of Charles I by Daniel Meitens. That crown no longer exists, but I do believe that Historic Royal Palaces recently recreated that crown using this portrait and also descriptions of it as well. What's also interesting is that that crown was thought to no longer exist at all, and very recently I think somebody found what they believe to be part of the crown, a small figure of Henry VI in a field in Northamptonshire, I think it was, which may be part of that crown. So part of that crown may have escaped. And it's thought that Charles I may have dropped the crown while on campaign during the civil wars, and that piece was never recovered. But of course, there are also the crown jewels feature heavily. So we've got the Imperial State Crown, for instance, the small diamond crown that Victoria had made for her to wear over her widow's cap. That still exists, that's still in the crown jewels. Of course, the main sceptres, and a lot of jewels are reused. So you see them reused through different crowns and different pieces of jewellery because they're very significant to the royal family. Let's have a look. Someone's asked, how long would it have taken to create a royal portrait? Would there have been several sittings?
Well, I mean, that's sort of, yes, one of those tantalising questions. From the historic period, it definitely seems that the artist was given a window of opportunity. And one of the paintings in the exhibition is a beautiful sort of fully worked up but sketch by Peter Lely of James II. And you get the real sense that this was the artwork that was produced during his encounter, his moment with the king. And then it was, he could then use that as the reference pattern to produce portraits on after that. And Elizabeth I is a very famous example of having sort of one likeness that then gets kind of replicated and reused. That said, I think the current Queen must be the person who has sat for her portrait the most in all of history, as she has kind of encountered many, many artists over the length of her reign. And that's something that I really enjoyed in the exhibition, of that we have, there are a number of portraits of the Queen in the Portrait Gallery's collection, and that sort of sense of spanning one sitter across their lifetime with this really extraordinary relationship to portraiture and the different kinds of artists who have produced her image. And so I think the Queen would be the best person to interview about the experience of sitting for portraits.
I believe she grants a certain amount of sittings, and then the rest of it is done from either preparatory sketches or photographs that are taken during those sittings. Because if you can imagine, the Queen's incredibly busy person, and so doesn't have a lot of time to sit for portraits. And there are also some interesting examples where we know kings and queens were very sort of loath to sit for portraits. For instance, we know George II hated having his portrait done, and a lot of portraits are copied from other portraits or are actually done from sort of furtive sketches of the king when he wasn't sitting. So it's interesting that some can bear the experience more than others. I think we might wrap up with this last question. These two questions sort of link to one another. How has royal portraiture changed since the advent of contemporary art and photography? And then someone also asked, is it true that Queen Victoria used to scratch herself out of some of her photographs? I think photography is really interesting because photography, when it comes along in 1840, really completely changes how the monarch can represent themselves. And you often think of the phrase that the camera never lies. But of course, for Victoria, the camera, she still had quite a lot of control over how she appeared in her photographs. Early photographs during Victoria's reign were really for personal consumption, weren't really there to be disseminated to the public. That only really happens from about 1860. But even in those early photographs where she got someone like William Kilburn, for instance, a key photographer for the royal family, to photograph the royal family, she would still sort of censor or look at photographs and approve them or reject them. And in one case, we know, for instance, in 1852, when a photograph was taken, that she reported in her diary that she looked absolutely horrid in the photo, and she went about scratching her face out on the negative. And we feature that on one of the interactives in the exhibition, so you can see that photograph if you come along to the exhibition.
I think the question of the kind of contemporary art is really interesting because all of the monarchs have been sort of at the forefront of the portraiture of their generation, of their time, often working in kind of pioneering new media. So whether it's embracing photography, for Henry VII, the kind of getting a Florentine sculptor to make his tomb in bronze, and then something like the Chris Levine portrait at the end, a lenticular portrait of Queen Elizabeth II. So this sort of sense, I think, with artists of when they're encountering the monarch and this kind of, they're dealing with this very long sort of time frame, this institution, how do you push the boundaries? And so how do you introduce innovation into this incredibly traditional context? And so they've got a whole reference material to kind of play with in 500 years of history, but then they want to put their new take on it, their new perception, new media. But that's something that's been playing out for centuries, that each new generation have been trying to do that. And I think you can really see that in this exhibition.
Definitely. Well, thank you for joining us this evening and for all the brilliant questions that you sent through. Thanks also to Charlotte from the National Portrait Gallery for joining us. I hope we have inspired you to visit Tudors to Windsors at the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. As I said, the exhibition is now coming into the last few weeks of its run and will be open till the 31st of October. So just to say thank you and goodbye from me and from Charlotte.
Goodbye.